there is a difference between the overall price of the dollar, that is the exchange rate of the dollar, and dollar dominance, which is a concept that basically refers to, what percentage of international financial transactions are carried in US currency, which is the US dollar, and what amount of international reserves are kept in US dollars. So those are completely different things. So the case that I made in a piece that I wrote for Dawn had to do with the fact that where it appears that the US would like to have a slightly weaker dollar, that is, to have some reduction in the value of the dollar, the US does not want to see any decrease in overall dollar dominance. But there is a connection between the two things. So, for example, if for whatever reason this program of having a slightly weaker dollar goes on some kind of an autopilot or goes out of control or takes on a dynamic of its own, then I think this would create a lot of very, worried people and investors around the world. And if they see that the dollar is actually declining in value more than what they expected it to decline in value, then we might see some kind of movement out of these international reserves that are basically held in US dollar. And as a matter of fact, we have been seeing in the last many years, very quietly, many central banks around the world have gradually been shifting from their dollar-based reserves to different currencies. There is the euro, there are other currencies. So the two things are definitely connected. And I think even if the US wants to have, or the current policymakers want to have a slightly weaker dollar, because that somehow increases the overall competitiveness of US exports, they need to be very, very careful, because if the process is seen to be taking a dynamic of its own, if you are facing lower interest rates, and there is a very, very high chance of that happening in the months to come, both for just macroeconomic reasons and also for political reasons, there might be a movement out of the dollar-based reserves. So I think I would advise caution to the US policymakers that they need to be very, very careful in trying to wish for a weaker dollar while trying to maintain overall dollar dominance in the world. The dollar's present dominance really can be traced back to the end of the Second World War, where primarily because of the efforts of one man, Harry Dexter White, who was representing the United States delegation to the Bretton Woods Conference. I mean, he was able to really place the US dollar in the middle of the international financial system. But as in the decades that followed, as time went on, one of the reasons why people accepted dollar's central position in the international financial system had to do with the strength of US institutions, various institutions, democracy, checks and balances, as well as property rights. And the idea was that compared to other nations, the US, because of the strength of its institutions, the ones that I have mentioned and many more, would be better able to withstand extreme economic crises, or what some people call black swans. And so there is a very, very, very strong link between overall desirability for the US dollar, people investing in US treasuries, and the strength of US political and economic institutions. However, in the last 1 year or so, primarily since this new administration in the US has taken oath, has taken power, we have seen a very sort of one after the other number of events in which these established principles of checks and balances, independence of policy making, independence of the central bank, independence of providing data, all of these have come under tremendous pressure. And I would like to cite two particular actually three particular instances. So a few days ago, the Trump administration relieved the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics of their job, citing that the data that had been generated was politicized. Now, this is a very serious, it's being seen as a very serious step by the political administration in trying to impact independent, data-based or evidence-based policy making. Fast forward, we find that the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, has been under tremendous pressure. I mean, matter of fact, President Trump has labeled him too late, supposedly because he was late in cutting interest rates. And he has used a number of other terms to describe or pressure the Fed chair in public. And only yesterday, one of the Fed governors, not the chair, one of the Fed governors, Dr. Lisa Cook, was quote unquote fired by President Trump for, some kind of, the term that he is using is some kind of malfeasance, but I think the time will tell whether that case can be, case holds water or not. So over the last few months, a number of steps have been taken by the Trump administration, which are being seen largely as steps that are now impacting the independence and consequently the strength or the quality of US institutions. And since dollar's dominance or its desirability or its acceptability in the world rests on US quality institutions, I mean, some people are really wondering if this becomes something that happens over and over again. And if this happens over and over again, this is definitely going to negatively impact the quality of US institutions and subsequently impact dollar's desirability and its overall dominance in the rest of the world. As to answer your question about whether there is any kind of a tipping point, I don't think so. I don't think there is going to be a substantive, identifiable tipping point as such. My fear is that, all these different steps are going to turn into a cascade of evaporating confidence in US institutions, which could then impact the dollar's dominance in the rest of the world. So there is no tipping point, but we seem to be on a path towards the dollar eventually its dominance becoming challenged or compromised by other currencies. There is a very strong connection between the success of US foreign policy goals and dollar's dominance. And whenever there is a need to use, economic levers to achieve foreign policy goals, the US has not been shy of doing it. And I think they have achieved a lot of success in the past. However, in the last 20 odd years, there has been an exponential increase in the number of sanctions that have been imposed. I think the number is, the number of individuals who were under sanctions in the year 2000 was about 900. And I think that number has blown up about 10 times in the last 20 odd years. So I think if that haphazard way of imposing economic sanctions does not stop, then I think that creates an incentive for a number of individuals as well as countries. And here I would like to bring in the freezing of Russian assets in the wake of the Russian-US conflict, Russia-Ukraine conflict. I think a number of other countries are watching what the US has done very, very carefully. And I think if there is a haphazard or an exponential increase in the number of economic sanctions, then I think the incentives will arise, which may force or which may compel other countries to divest out of US dollar. The way they have been implemented in the last 20 years, then I think the probability of a serious flight out of US dollar-based reserves is very likely in the future. I think some of the events that are happening, some of the variables that are going to bring a decrease in dollar dominance at the realistic level are already with us. I mean, so we have these huge economies in the rest of the world that are increasing in size. We have China, we have India, and naturally, once the size of these economies starts becoming bigger and bigger, there is going to be a lesser, how should I say, dependence on the US dollar. Couple that with some of the other things that are happening in the US. I mean, we talked about a certain trend that we have observed vis-a-vis US institutions. And if that trend continues unabated, again, we are going to see a flight out of dollar-based reserves. Now, to answer your question, what guardrails can the US put up? I think the two main things that I would advise the US policymakers to look at. Number one, and that has to do with making sure that the reasons that have made US dollar the dominant currency in the world, i.e., good quality, high quality US institutions, democracy, checks and balances, property rights, as well as the US contribution in creating this our present post Second World War geo-economic system or the international economic order. I think the US policymakers would be well advised to ensure that both of these continue into the future for as long as possible. So here I'm talking about ensuring high quality US institutions as well as the present international economic order, which, for better or worse, has served a number of countries really well. And now, what guardrails can they put into the system in order to have some kind of responsible dollar leadership? I think I would advise working US policymakers with the international institutions like the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank in ensuring a continuation of this present international economic order and probably recalibrating, reassessing the use and efficacy of imposing haphazard and exponential and to check the exponential increase of in US sanctions in the last 20 odd years.